Hello, everyone. I'm glad you came back today. In my world, it is snowing. We're part of the cold front that moved through in February, so I'm looking out to a lot of snow. But it just gives us more reason to see the seasons and see what God has done. Today's lesson is on Jesus stands trial. You know, since its founding in 1992, there is a nonprofit organization called the Innocence Project, and it's responsible for exonerating hundreds of people who, through DNA testing, have been found innocent. So that therefore found the Innocent Project. But these people had been tried and sentenced by mistake because someone falsely accused them. And we can relate to that. Jesus was falsely accused too. His own people wanted him to be convicted so that they could hand him over to be killed. Now, if I would put the words up unjustly or unfairly tried, unjustly accused, unfairly tried, what does that stir up in your insides? What if this was pertaining to you, that you had been unjustly accused or unfairly tried? Most people would do anything to avoid being in that situation to begin with, but if they find themselves in that situation, they would fight back, finding them, trying to get out of the situation, trying to prove. Well, Jesus was wrongly accused, but he didn't fight back, and we're going to find out why and how that pertains to us. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples, and all the rest of them fled. And then that led to him to be taken before the Roman government. And Jesus then faced rejection beyond anything that we could ever imagine. But his attitude and his behavior in those darkest hours, right before his death, serve as our best example for when we have our darkest hour, for when we face harsh treatment by others. Since Jesus had done nothing but good, it may seem surprising that he was even tried or arrested and then put to death. However, Jesus wasn't surprised. He knew all of this was going to happen and how it was going to happen. He knew the sinfulness of man, of humankind, of humanity. That's why he came to the earth. He knew how we would react. We needed a better example. He also knew that his Father's plan was going to require his death and his resurrection. So as we study Mark chapter 14 today, it should remind us of our own lives, some of the things that we have done, and know that they are not a surprise to God. He is not surprised by what you did. And so you can trust him to help you to respond in his love when you're confronted by challenges in your life. Starting in Mark chapter 14, but towards the end, it's verses 43 to 47. These events in Mark took place the night before Jesus was to be crucified. So at this time, his death was approaching. And so he took his disciples, and he knew his death was approaching, so he took his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he left them off there. And then he went a little bit further and took Peter, James, and John, his inner circle. He took them to be a little closer to him. And then he went on to another site where he fell to the ground in a heart-wrenching prayer. Well, going a little further, Jesus' disciples allowed themselves to fall asleep. And he had repeatedly gone back and awakened them. And you remember the story. Can't you stay awake for just a little bit? And so now he was going back for the third time to awaken them. But when he got back there, he found Judas and a whole crowd of men carrying clubs and swords. And they had been sent there by the highest religious authorities of Israel. They were ready to apprehend Jesus, and they were ready to fight off any resistance from Jesus or his disciples should they come against them. But that wasn't the case. Judas told them to arrest Jesus and take him under guard, or that meant take him safely away. Well, early in his ministry, Jesus had walked through many crowds of angry crowds, and their intent was to kill him. And Judas was in those crowds, and he was following Jesus, so he had seen how Jesus could just slip away, or his disciples could crowd around him, and Jesus would just be gone. And so he was aware of that, and he didn't want to take any chance on those accompanying him that they would lose Jesus. And that's why they had come so heavily armed. Well, Jesus' treatment of Judas epitomized the bitterness of betrayal by someone that's close to you. Judas had been with Jesus for 3 years. He called him rabbi, meaning master or teacher. That was a title of great honor, and that's what Judas felt towards Jesus or said towards him. And then that night, he greeted Jesus with a kiss. This wasn't uncommon for the disciples to greet their teacher this way. In fact, James and John had encouraged that the disciples greet Jesus this way as a term of endearment in the early church, or to even greet each other to show that they had like minds. The gospel accounts portray that Peter was prone to impulse. Well, that's no news. We've been studying the last couple of lessons and Peter just keeps coming up doing something impulsive. And so we know here he was just attempting to defend Jesus, and he lashed out with a sword, and remember, he cut off one of the high priest's servants' ears. But Jesus, as I said, did not want to resist this arrest. He knew that it was necessary. It was part of his Father's redemptive plan. And so he picked the ear up and healed the young man. Well, many of us have felt betrayed before in our lives. But do you hear any kind of this betrayal that Jesus went through that was as bad as that? Was your betrayal that bad? Was your experience, did it pale in comparison to the utter betrayal that Jesus endured? For more than 3 years, Judas had followed Jesus, listened to his teachings, witnessed his miracles, and now he's betraying Jesus with a kiss, a part of a seemingly loving greeting. Well, after his arrest, Jesus uttered a statement that was going to be a foreshadow of events to follow in the next several hours. He said, "Am I in rebellion that you had to come with clubs and swords to arrest me?" Because he knew that there was going to be one that they would capture that did lead a rebellion that actually led to deaths of the Roman soldiers, and that was Barabbas. And he knew that he was going to be offered up with Barabbas to give the Jews a decision to choose freedom for one of them, but only one of them, because they would both be prisoners. Well, Jesus pointed out an ironic nature of his arrest. He said, "You have taken me by force. Do I look dangerous?" He said, "And you took me at night, despite the fact that where do you find me? Every day in the temple in the daytime. And you could have taken me any time while I did my teachings, but you chose at night," which he thought was very appropriate, because you know these things had the energy, it says in verse 53, the energy of the power of darkness. And who is that? Satan. So they had to take him in the dark. And Jesus knew that this just provided an opportunity to point out that God allowed these events of Jesus' arrest to occur, so as they did, so that the prophecies of his word could be fulfilled the way they were written. One such prophecy was in Zechariah 13:7, which says in part, "Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." And we know that's what's happened. Jesus' sheep, his disciples, were scattered. The disciples feared their own lives. They deserted Jesus and fled from those who seized him because they were afraid that they would be taken as well. Now, verse 51 and 52 here records an incident that appears only in Mark. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, tell about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ from 4 different perspectives. But every now and then you'll find a tidbit of something in one gospel that's not in the other. And that's the way it is with verse 51 and 52. It appears only there that this young man following Jesus fled naked, leaving his garment in the hands of those who were trying to apprehend Jesus. Well, he wasn't naked because, as was their custom, they wore their undergarments, underwear, and then they had the sheath or like a dress that came over, and then they had their robe, and that was the colorful part. And it was just, it was open, flowing, had the big armholes, that's what they put over it. And it seems that this man was covered with a fine linen garment, but it was over, and it says he must have come there in haste, and that he was... his robe was all he had on him. So it was easy to snatch that because it was open. There were no fastenings anywhere. And so the commentators believe, though, that this young man was Mark himself. It is noteworthy that this young man did stay with Jesus, it said, until he was taken. But then he, like all the others, fled. It said, while Jesus held all authority, if he didn't want those men to take him, they could not have. Their weapons were nothing for him. So we take note of earlier studies. It says that he allowed himself to be taken there in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was never stripped of his authority when he came to earth. He gave his life willingly. Now it said, why do you think that the disciples fled at this time? Because, like we said before, he was in many other crowds where they were trying to kill him, and they stayed with him, and they covered him so he could get away. Why now? I think it was just more intense, the opposition, and two, it was following the will of God. God's plan for salvation and redemption all had to follow certain things that he had prophesied, and this was one of them, that Jesus be taken. Well, Jesus was taken then to the high priest. Now, the high priest, that he didn't hold the title, but he still held the authority, and that was Annas, Annas, and he had 5 sons and then apparently a son-in-law, because Caiaphas was his son-in-law, and after Annas received Jesus, he sent him on to Caiaphas then. He reviewed the what was being held against Jesus, and then he said, well, take him down to Caiaphas. So he still held a lot of authority, but he had already retired at this time. So Jesus was taken to Caiaphas, who was the high priest, and then the entire body of the Sanhedrin. Remember, we talked about this last week. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish court, and it had all the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law in it. And Peter followed and was admitted with the help of John into the high priest's courtyard. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that. John was able to go in, and it was okay. Peter was not, and he kind of slinked around the corners. He kind of just stayed at the doorway, and then he was going to find his way in to just kind of like slide in. Well, Rome did not allow the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, to carry out the death sentence. And we know the Romans carried that out, but that was according to the law. They were not allowed to. The Sanhedrin wasn't. They could condemn the man, bring the charges against, show him that the person warranted having death penalty, but that's as far as they could go. They needed first to condemn them and then hand them over to the Romans. And according to Deuteronomy 17:6, it said the death penalty required the testimony of at least 2 witnesses. And try as they may, the Sanhedrin could not find 2 witnesses to carry out this plan. 2 false witnesses then were paid, and they quoted Jesus as saying, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will I build another, not made with human hands. Verses 57 and 58. Now, what they said appears to be a misrepresentation of what Jesus said. He did say that, but he didn't. If he had said, I will destroy the temple in 3 days, that would have been a capital offense, and yes, he would have warranted the death penalty, but that's not what he said. He said, I will destroy this temple, and in 3 days raise up again. So that's what he was saying, and that was in John chapter 2, verse 19. Because he, in fact, did not say that he was going to destroy the temple. But time and time again, more and more, they didn't lack anybody testifying against Jesus. People just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And so Caiaphas said, "What do you say against all of these?" Oh, he didn't say anything. But even those two false witnesses that they paid to say something against Jesus, the way they said it conflicted. Everybody's testimony, even all those many, many people that kept coming, they all conflicted. They contradicted each other's, the accusations. So having failed to build a case with witnesses, the high priest then attempted to see if Jesus would incriminate himself. So, of course, he asked him to testify against all those testimonies of false witnesses, and Jesus wouldn't say anything. That's in Isaiah 53:7. And then he asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus replied, "I am." Emphasis on I, as opposed to many others say they are, but I am. And he went on to say that he was the Son of Man. Now, this was a messianic title, and he said, "I'm going to return on the clouds of the heavens. I will sit at the right hand of the mighty one." Oh, he was just saying all kinds of accusations, things that they felt were incriminating to him. And so believing Jesus was being blasphemous because nobody was the Son of God but Jesus, so nobody before him had said that. And they didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, so they thought he was being blasphemous. And so Caiaphas, I don't think he was that religious, but he acted like he was. He just rent his clothes. Can't believe someone would say something like that. He went back to the Sanhedrin and said, "You don't need any more witnesses. If this man is saying he's the Messiah, the Son of God, you need to make sure he is killed. He must die." Well, you know very well that the Jewish leaders were determined to have Jesus put to death. Yet, they lacked the power to do so. They could not put him to death. They had to find enough reason. I mean, they would have already killed him if they were allowed to carry out the death penalty. But they weren't, so they had to come across evidence enough to request his death, and they couldn't. Instead, they enlisted witnesses that were willing to lie about Jesus, and even they contradicted each other. They couldn't agree. Therefore, their statements were considered invalid. What were they going to do now? And that's when, not to be deterred, they used Jesus' very own statement that he indeed was the Messiah, and they held that against him. It says that after being condemned by the Sanhedrin then, Jesus suffered great physical and verbal attacks by those who were holding him. They mocked his miraculous knowledge and his power that he said he had. They blindfolded him, and then they started beating him, and then they said, "Prophesy to us," or identify who is beating you if you know so much and you're so miraculous. Violent blows. Meanwhile, Peter attempted to avoid being identified as one of Christ's followers, even though one of the high priest's servant girls came by and said, "Aren't you one of the ones that was with Jesus?" Well, he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even understand why you would say that." But although Peter tried to avoid her, it says that the servant girl saw him again. Now, in 3 of the 4 Gospels, it sounds like it's a different servant girl. And even in the one in Mark, it says a servant girl again saw him. So it doesn't particularly mean, I think it was a different servant girl. And they said this time, the second time that a servant girl saw him and made this statement, "You look like one that was with Jesus." She did it more loudly, and it drew a lot more attention to him. And so there was a bystander, a man, that came by, and he said, "Well, he dresses and talks like one of the Galileans. I know he was with Jesus." And I think this man would know, because if you read in John chapter 18:26, it said the man that spoke was the one that Peter had cut his ear off. So I think he knew who Peter was. But this is his strongest denial. When that man said, I think he's a Galilean, so he's with him, it said that Peter swore that he didn't know Jesus. He said, the curses of God be upon him. So he used curses and swearing, and so we think that would be profanity, but that was not. He was talking about a curse would be on him if he in fact said that he did know Jesus, and that, or he took an oath. He took an oath that involved a curse that would be on him if he in fact did know Jesus. So that's how it was used. And he's saying, if I broke my word, there'd be the curse on me. And in a sense, Peter was expressing a level of shame for the Lord, because in Mark chapter 8:38, it said, if you deny me before man, I will deny you before my Father. And Peter did deny him. And Peter even promised him in Mark chapter 14, verse 31, that I would rather die than deny you. But we know that he did deny him. He denied him repeatedly and emphatically. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand it. But following his resurrection, Jesus did allow Peter to reaffirm his love for him. But at this present time that we're talking, Peter was overcome by the weight of his failure. He realized what he'd done, and he began weeping bitterly. And so here we have Jesus has been betrayed by one of his disciples, Judas, and then his disciples deserted him, and now we have another disciple who is denying him, Peter. And you've got to remember, Peter was one of his inner circle. Peter, James, and John got to go with him on the Transfiguration. But like I said, when we do these things, Jesus is not surprised. He knew it was going to happen. He wasn't surprised that he would have a failure. And you know, Jesus is not surprised at your failure. Jesus had a great plan for Peter, just like he has a great plan for you in your life and the people that you will be responsible for. Jesus had grace for him. And so you can have grace too, no matter what you've done or what you're going to do. Remember what Peter had done 3 different times. And Jesus even told him he was going to do it. And he even took oaths that I would never do that. And still, Jesus loved him and had a great plan for him and forgave him. Well, here we go. Now the Roman governor of Judea. He was governor probably for about 10 years, AD, 26 AD to 36 AD. And so his name was Pontius Pilate, we know that. Pilate had his residence along the Mediterranean around Caesarea. But when he came to Jerusalem, he resided in the great King Herod's palace. And this is away from the temple. He wasn't in the temple. He was in the palace that was erected by Herod the Great. But since Roman officials were there to do work, now they had come this particular weekend for Passover. But he was there, and they only came to get work done. And they started very early, about 6 in the morning. At daybreak, it said. And since the Jewish rulers had worked all night bringing charges against Jesus. Remember, they came at night in the Garden of Gethsemane. So it was probably midnight or after when they were holding this kangaroo court and brought the charges against him. So by the time 5 or 6 o'clock got there, they were able to take Jesus right to Pilate. Now, there was a law back then, and it said you cannot condemn a man on the same day that you sentence him. What did they do to Jesus? He was tried, condemned, and will be crucified, all without due process. And he was going to be crucified that very day. So, as you can see, even if what they did was bad enough, they did it in sequence. They didn't even give him an extra day between his being condemned and being crucified. Well, the high priests and the Sanhedrin had charged Jesus with blasphemy, right? The Roman government, they were Gentiles. They could care less if he was charged with blasphemy. So to say that he's condemned to death because of blasphemy, the Jews, that was serious, not to the Roman government. So they had to change it in a way that would be meaningful to the Roman government. Well, it appears that the Jewish rulers were very sensitive to anyone that was causing a rebellion. And so they changed it and said that he was guilty of treason. And that was due to the fact that there was a lot of political unrest at this time. Remember, the Jews were always trying to get free. So when they had rebellions, it was trying to free them from the Roman rule. And so it was noteworthy that Pilate was known to be very cruel to the Jewish people. And so when he carried out any sentences, it was more cruel than what it needed to be. And so they thought if they told Pilate that he was causing uprisings or treasons to go against the Roman government, that he would be more likely to sentence Jesus to death. Well, with the concern of a rebellion in mind, then Pilate said, "Is that true what they say?" Because they said that he's saying he's the Son of Man, and so it made it sound like he was trying to be the king, take over things. He says, "Is this what they're saying, that you're King of the Jews? That you think that you're King of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Well, that's what you say that I am." But it was a way of saying, yes, I do say that I'm King of the Jews. Well, the Jews weren't allowed to enter the palace, since to do so would make them considered unclean. Remember, I said that the Romans were Gentiles, and this was Passover weekend, and so if they went in, they couldn't participate in the Passover festivities. I mean, they could have gone in there, but they would have had been cleansed first, and there wasn't time to be cleansed and take part in the Jewish Passover. So they didn't want to be defiled. So Jesus was taken. He was in the palace, but now he's taken out into the courtyard so that they can hear what's going on. And he was accused by the chief priests by many things. In Luke chapter 23, verse 2, it says, along with him claiming that he was the Messiah, Jesus was also accused of subversion, of opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar. Now, see, that was another thing they were coming against him, because Caesar was Pilate's boss. He was over Pilate. So if they could say something that was going to get Pilate in trouble, he still might be more apt to sentence him to death. So Pilate was just amazed that Jesus just sat there in silence while they said one accusation after another, just kept saying them. And so he finally said, "Aren't you going to say anything?" He gave him the opportunity to apply against these. And Jesus said nothing. And that spoke louder than words. Pilate was not a dumb person. He may not have been a Jew or a Christian, but he could see. He said, when you're blameless and you remain silent, that's more powerful than any defense that you could give. The enemies of Jesus had to twist the truth and modify their original accusations against Jesus in a way to manipulate Pilate into doing what they wanted him to do. Like I said, the Jews were not concerned. It didn't bother them that it was treason, but they knew that would be meaningful to the Roman government, and they had to frame their argument so that Pilate would see it as a matter of concern to the Roman government. Well, those gathered at Pilate's residence had a choice to make now. According to the custom, and we've heard this before, they had an opportunity to release, during the time of Passover festival, one prisoner. And one of the choices would be Jesus, and the other choice was Barabbas. And that was a man accused of insurrection and murder in the uprising. The insurrection was bad enough, but this one caused some Roman soldiers to be killed. And there'd been numerous insurrections taking place during the time of the Roman control over Israel. And like I said, that these insurrections were attempts to free the Jewish people from the Roman power. But since someone was killed, then Barabbas was apprehended. So at this time, we've had Jesus taken to Annas, then Caiaphas, and then the Sanhedrin. And then the Sanhedrin condemned him of treason, so they sent him to Pilate. Pilate said, "I just can't find anything that you've said of him that is reason to put him to death. So the people said, but you've got to see how much he stirred up things. They wanted to emphasize that treason. They said, he has had uprising. They didn't say he has had uprising. They said he's stirring up stuff by the way he talks and what he says. He started in Galilee doing that, and now he's brought it to Jerusalem. He's stirring all these people up. So they thought if he's stirring them up, that brings them to an insurrection. It's kind of like here recently we've heard about a man. What he said stirred people up. And so it led to a rebellion or a riot. Same thing. So you can see it's still happening today. And they can be falsely accused. But when he said he was from that he had started this in Galilee, then that's when Pilate said, oh, a Galilean, if he's a Galilean, this is Herod's court, not mine. So he sent Jesus on then from Pilate to Herod. What? Herod was tickled to get him. Herod hadn't seen or talked to Jesus yet. And he was intrigued by Jesus. He had heard that he did these miraculous things that people wanted to follow him. So Herod loved it that they brought him towards him. He saw him as a court gesture, as entertainment. It was like, oh, good, I get to have him in my own court, and I can see some of these miracles that he's going to do. So he questioned him, but the questions had nothing to do with what he was condemned from, what he was arrested for. Herod just wanted to get to know him. Why did the people love him so? Why did how could he do all these miracles? So he couldn't find anything either, so he sent him back to Pilate. Well, it says, perhaps in attempt to preserve Jesus' life, Pilate asked the crowd, "What do you really? Wouldn't you like to release Jesus? I mean, he is the king of the Jews." And this was sarcastic. He didn't believe he was king of the Jews, but it's like, I can see no wrong that he has done. And so, he is your king, so wouldn't you want him released? And they're going, no, we want Barabbas. But Pilate realized, it was the chief priests that were instigating all of this, these people rising up and wanting Jesus crucified. And like I said, Pilate wasn't dumb. He could see that these chief priests felt they couldn't compete with what Jesus was teaching, or Jesus' loving character, or the miracles that he performed. These priests were nothing around Jesus. No wonder the people wanted him to be their religious leader. So Jesus was brought to them out of their own envy and self-interest. And the chief priests were inciting the people then to ask for Barabbas instead, because Barabbas was a man after their own heart. He was leading the insurrections to free them against the Roman government. So the priests were saying, no, we want Barabbas. He's on our side. Well, Pilate and Herod at this point decided they'd join up, because neither one of them wanted to condemn him to death. So they just kind of washed their hands of it. At this point, Pilate, who was known for his harsh control of the Jews, released his control to those around him. He asked the crowd, well, what do you want me to do with this Jesus? And they said, well, we want you to crucify him. So despite the fact that no one could come up with any capital offense, which it had to be in order to condemn him to death, they kept insisted that they crucify him. So he hadn't done any evil. In fact, they weren't crucifying him for the evil he had done. They were crucifying him for all the good that he had done. So Pilate's desire to please the people overrode the innocence of Jesus. Because remember, if the Jews didn't like what Herod and Pilate were doing, they could go to Caesar over his head. And remember, Caesar was Pilate's boss. And he delegated and gave Pilate control over this area. And if he couldn't control his people and do what they liked, then he was going to be in trouble. So he gave in to the people. He released Barabbas to them and decided to flog Jesus. And we all know flogging. Roman flogging utilized a whip of leather strips, and they were embedded at the ends with bone and metal. Jewish flogging, you could only hit a man so many times. But Roman flogging, you could hit them as many times as you wanted until they were dead. So there was no limit. So as we read in the account of Jesus' arrest, and his trial, and his crucifixion this week, it seems there was no end to the suffering, both physical and verbal, that Jesus had to endure, all for us, all for a part of his Father's redemptive plan. And a result of this, the other side of the coin, if he would do all of that suffering for us, then there's no end to the love that he has for us. He willingly submitted to his Father's plan for our redemption. So each of us has this example, and that's why things are put in the Bible. It's for our example, so that we can learn from it. It's our directions. Each of us can shape our own commitment to God by using the examples that Jesus has provided for us in his Bible, in his instruction book. So I hope you learn something this week that you can take with you that will strengthen you, that you can realize when people come against you and wrongfully use you, that it's of no surprise to Jesus, no surprise to God. He already went through it, been there, done that. He's provided a way for you. He's provided instruction for you. And he will be with you all the way, guiding and directing you and helping you to forgive those who come against you. You need to rely on God to make wise decisions that come from the right motives. That when you make decisions to do something, that it doesn't come out of revenge, because your betrayal pales in comparison to what Jesus had to go through. Pray for those in leadership, both in our church and our government, that they will make good decisions. We're coming now, we're just off of a new election and a new leader for our country, the United States, and we can pray. That's all we can do. They're not going to ask for our advice. So we need to pray that they make the right decisions, because we will be affected. I love you, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.